Yikes, this is an awful video to have to be making. Those of you guys that know the video that this is in response to, yeah, this is going to be interesting. And, you know, the irony of this is not lost on me in any shape or form. So for those of you guys that, you know, are coming at this and you have an emotional response to, you know, one side or the other or whatnot, you know, try and just, you know, understand the facts of what's going on here or whatever. Anyway, this is just one of those unfortunate circumstances where instead of a debate, things turned, you know, nasty on one side, which, you know, I apologize for, you know, or if my critique of Doug's methods or his models came off as personal, but you know, I tried to keep it as contextual as possible. Like, you know, the math just wasn't correct, and you know, I disagree about some exercises. I disagree with everybody about, you know, certain exercises and things like that. And we have these discussions, and I think that's awesome, and that's particularly fun and entertaining. I find it stimulating. Clearly, Doug did not like the fact that I pointed out some mathematical issues and had some different opinions on the most efficient or best exercises than him. And so rather than debating me so much, Doug accuses me of being deceptive, dishonest, and disagreeing with him for profit, and applies that anyone who agrees with me is out to get him. And the fact that he's accusing me of being deceptive and dishonest in the video that he makes is quite ironic. So if you are in Camp Doug, like, you don't have to do any of the stuff I do. You don't have to like any of the stuff I do, but you should watch this because this is just going to point out some things, and then hopefully you at least, you know, maybe you hate me a little bit less, or at least you know that, like, I wasn't being dishonest or deceptive in the way that Doug is falsely portraying it out to be. If you've watched the original video that I did, then probably you already know that most of the stuff in the follow-up video is either taken out of context or completely false. So let's do a quick recap. If you haven't watched my video of critique, you know, I go through some math and some things like that or whatever, but here's the quick summary, right? I demonstrated that Doug's models that are basically correlating the limb angle of tibias and forearms to what he calls load magnification, which we basically just determined, you know, it's the moment arm that we're talking about, you know, are not accurate. And they're not accurate in a way that created bias in those exercise comparisons towards exercises that, you know, he really likes or whatnot. And that doesn't mean that that bias is not right or that those exercises weren't good, but the models themselves were inaccurate in both directions. So they would make for instance, in the squat versus leg extension, the model would be disadvantageously inaccurate to the squat, and it would be advantageously accurate to the leg extension. And there was a pattern of this, so I covered a couple different examples of that to show that, you know, the way the model is being simplified, there's a significant bias in that. And then that bias was further compounded by other variables such as, you know, lever lengths and the exercise selection. For instance, in the squat versus leg extension, it was a very, you know, we'll say hip dominant squat being compared to the leg extension. In the dip versus tricep extension, it was a very chest, like, you know, lean forward type dip being compared. And so I provided some other perspective on what a more appropriate squat for quads and what maybe in a more appropriate dip for triceps would look like to kind of decrease that bias, as well as going through the math correctly. And, you know, I agreed with Doug on some of the principles or some of the things that, you know, you were trying to accomplish in terms of being efficient or whatnot. But I think if we're taking multiple things into consideration when we're choosing an exercise, or we're choosing, you know, how good or how to rate an exercise or where this exercise fits in the program, that there's a degree of accuracy that helps make sure that we have the right magnitude, and we don't just, like, you know, blow things out of proportion to make it seem like, well, this exercise is really bad and therefore this exercise is really good, when that may not be the case if you actually count the cards accurately. So I discussed how these comparisons also may just be completely irrelevant in some cases. So, for example, in a squat versus the leg extension, like the amount of load magnification that there is in a leg extension versus, you know, a squat is completely irrelevant to whether or not you're going to choose the leg extension for the squat. Like, you don't need to do any math to know that the leg extension just moves at the knee and that the squat incorporates other things. You don't need to do anything to realize that the leg extension is going to load the top of the motion where the knee is fully extended. And when you stand up in a squat, you're basically doing nothing, right? You don't need to do any math to know that, well, if you do a squat, especially if you have the ankle mobility or use a wedge or whatever, that you can can basically get to full knee flexion, and in pretty much every leg extension machine, getting to full knee flexion is not really going to happen. You're always going to be limited by the pad that's behind your knee, and then there's resistance profile differences and all these other things that necessarily don't have to quantify, the load magnification, right? The simple a simple way of looking at this is if you simply move the shin pad higher on a leg extension, then you have to use more load on that machine to get the same amount of resistance. That doesn't make the loading any less perpendicular, right? It doesn't change the angle of loading, it just changes that lever length. The fact that you're using more load doesn't make it any less quads, it doesn't make it any worse. In fact, if we're looking at something like shear, it actually decreases the shear at the knee. So, there are, instances where people will use a higher pad position to decrease that shearing force in the knee. Now, I'm not a person that thinks that the shearing force in a leg extension is something that has to be avoided in anybody with a healthy knee by any means, but that is a common thing, and it doesn't take any away. So this is simply an irrelevant comparison, and so exaggerating that comparison as a justification of leg extension is good, squat bad, or leg extension is efficient and squat's not. That's where I'm like, maybe this is a bit of a misleading message in terms of what these model is suggesting in terms of exercise selection. And if you know me, you know that I'm not pro squat, everybody's got a squat or whatever. We basically barely use squats if we have better options. But we're not disproportionately unfair to the squat because we have those other options. We talk about exercises, the pros and cons that they have so that you can use the best tool for the job for the individual. Anyway, lastly, I discussed why I like the leg extension, which is an exercise that Doug also likes, so we agreed that that's a good exercise. But why also I would rate the cable sissy squat and the cable squat quite low because of their decreased stability, loadability, range of motion, and resistance challenge. Basically all of those things, which in Doug's video he basically misinterprets. I don't know if that's that he didn't watch the video or he purposely misinterprets, loadability and resistance challenge, etc., based off of the description I gave in my video. But essentially because of those things, when I'm looking at all of the variables or just the variables that I happen to choose that were the biggest rocks, why I ranked the cable squat and the cable sissy squat below all of the other exercises, and I provided my justification for that, right? And that was an objective justification. And, Doug took this as he put my exercise at the bottom, so he's out to get me. And dude, before I even know who you were, it's not like I had everybody doing cable squats and stuff instead of hack squats or whatever it may be, and he points out that, I used a modified sissy squat, leg extension thing when I was locked in my garage or whatever. And yeah, I was playing around doing some stuff with bands or whatever, I posted a picture of it. Do I think it was the best all-BL exercise? No. Do I actually think it was a better exercise than the cable sissy squat variation he does? For the purpose I was using it for, yeah. You didn't see me doing these type of exercises in lockdown when I was extremely limited. So we have obviously some very different opinions on the mechanics, the math, and how much this stuff matters, when it matters, etc. And that's cool. That's fine. We have different methods, we have different opinions, etc. That doesn't mean that one opinion is malicious or the other, right? So we can sit here and we can talk about the facts, and it doesn't have to be personal. But that's apparently off the table in terms of discussion and debate, both whether indirectly or directly, to my understanding at this point. So just to kind of give you guys a bit of clarification on the chart here and maybe provide a little bit of educational benefit to this video before I just go into, all of the false statements that were made. This was my made up chart of things to illustrate my point. And essentially when we're looking at the cable squat and the cable sissy squat, why did they end up at the bottom here when I'm using, this comparison here and I threw these numbers in here? Obviously, for one, I literally titled this as my made up chart of things to illustrate my point. So to come in and be like, well, you can't use this or whatever, this was a visual for me to, describe this, right? And so when it comes to stability, if I'm comparing a barbell squat to a sissy squat or a cable squat, I find that the cable sissy squat and the cable squat have a more challenging balance component to them than the barbell squat. So they ranked lower on stability. In terms of loadability, it's no question that you can easily load a barbell squat or whatever better than a cable squat or cable sissy squat. And now when I say loadability, it's not about how many pounds you put on, it's about the relative intensity at which you can do that exercise proficiently. So, if you're somebody that can do a cable sissy squat, 3 rep max, props to you, right? But when it comes to training heavy or lower rep range, I find the loadability of the squat to be far superior than the cable squat and the cable sissy squat for multiple reasons. I mean, one, you have your foot being pulled forward in the shoe, you're balancing the weight, getting back into that position where like pretty much every element of those exercises is worse when you're using a more challenging load. Now, you'll see in muscular bias, which again is a thing that Doug misinterpreted. He somehow thinks that muscular bias is related to perpendicularness or whatever, right? And muscular bias is the participation of that tissue in comparison to the participation of other tissues. So did I rank the cable sissy squat higher than the barbell squat? Well, absolutely, because the cable squat is going to be less glutes and hip extensors or whatever than a barbell squat, right? Especially because you can't use that much load, etc. So I've ranked prospectively the cable sissy squat and the cable squat higher than the heel elevated squat and the barbell squat, respectively. So muscular bias, yeah, I gave them that points. That was, something that worked in their direction, but they weren't as biased as better options like the leg extension or the pendulum squat or quad dominant hack squat, for example. Now, range of motion was another important factor, right? So, and I based the range of motion of Doug's cable sissy squat and cable squat off of his actual demonstrations. And when he's demonstrating the cable sissy squat in his course, he basically doesn't go below 90 degrees of knee flexion, right? And he doesn't get that much knee flexion in the cable squat either. So in terms of range of motion, I think, unless you happen to be a person that's really built poorly for a squat, in which case, you throw some heel elevation on there, whatever, is that most people are going to be able to go through a greater degree of knee flexion in a barbell squat than they are the cable squat or the cable sissy squat, right? So in that aspect, I ranked the barbell squat and the barbell heel elevated squat higher, as well as pretty much every other exercise higher than the sissy squats. But in fact, I actually ranked the barbell squat and the cable sissy squat the exact same, because even though you can get more knee flexion in the squat than you can in Doug's demo, I accounted for the fact that you are getting a little bit more range of motion in the rec fem. So I made that comparison as fair as possible, right? The last one here that I have is the best available resistance, which resistance challenge I clarified is what I'm referring to as a resistance curve or resistance profile. Some people get upset if you use the term resistance profile and you're not like, hashtag Tom Purvis. Tom Purvis, that's a term that he's used and coined in forever. So all credits, all hail Tom Purvis. But in terms of resistance challenge, this was just a way of me kind of simplifying that of like, can you make it hard, throughout more of the range of motion, or is it just hard in one spot? And this is an area where Doug got really upset that I said the cable sissy squat and the cable squat had essentially like the worst resistance curve out of all of these exercises. And the reason that is because while a free weight barbell squat or a hack squat or a leg press, etc., all of those exercises will be biased towards the bottom position. In the cable squat or the cable sissy squat, basically the profile is so exaggerated to that position where, they get so easy in the mid-range. Like they get progressively easier in the mid-range than some of these other exercises, especially when we account for the fact that these other exercises offer the opportunity to add accommodating resistance like, chains, bands, reverse bands, different cams and a leg extension, etc. So in terms of the profile, it's, Doug likes to use this term early phase loading, where he likes to load the lengthened position basically of most of these exercises, which isn't a bad thing or a good thing. But the thing is, it's not a infinite scale that the more lengthened bias it is, the better. It just needs to be challenging enough in that position, right? But making it even more biased towards that position just decreases the challenge in the rest of the range of motion. So if we're talking about having an exercise that actually is creating mechanical tension and stimulus through a greater degree of the range of motion, then that's where we would look at the cable sissy squat and the cable squat and in comparison to these other exercises, especially when we consider good machines, use of accommodating resistance, etc., tempo, different things that we can do to kind of modify the stimulus. Those other exercises have a superior advantage because they can be more challenging through a greater percentage of the range of motion. And that's how my scores ended up the way they were. And you'll actually see that, the difference between like the cable squat and cable sissy squat is not that much different from the barbell variations. The big jump happens when you get to use those machines and you eliminate a lot of the obstacles that are based off a person's structure and range of motion. So that's my recap of this chart and pretty much covering all of that again because Doug misinterpreted loadability, muscular bias, and resistance challenge. I don't know if that was on purpose or, if he just didn't watch the video and just commented on the chart, which would be ironic because one of Doug's critique of people that disagree with him always is like, well, they haven't read all of my book or watched all of my videos, which I, out of respect, took and did that, right? And I mean, for me, this was not something that was going to benefit me personally to read that book and go through all those videos or whatever, right? Because this isn't stuff that I haven't learned before. And obviously, learning it or looking at things that are incorrect versus having learning in a system that is more correct, like obviously it's not worth spending a bunch of time looking at models that are oversimplified and inaccurate, etc. So, I just think that's, a very unfair critique at that point in time for, Doug to be throwing that out there and then completely misinterpreting things that I described in my video. So let me just quickly summarize Doug's responses, and then we'll kind of go through point by point some of the most egregious falsehoods, in here. So one, we agree the math isn't accurate, but Doug insists that it's accurate enough, right? This statement right here, we agree that it isn't accurate, but Doug is the one, not I, but Doug insists it's accurate enough, okay? This is the area we disagree, especially when being accurate takes very little effort. In terms of these models, the difference between doing them right and, doing them in a biased fashion, it's a minimal difference in effort, right? A minimal difference in effort. Now, I can understand using a simplification for, doing suggesting a principle of like, yes, okay, so the greater an angle, the more resistance there is. But once you start putting numbers together and comparing exercises, I don't think that then these models are accurate because they don't accurately show the magnitude of difference between two exercises, right? So in a lot of these instances, they're much closer, making this thing a much smaller degree of importance compared to other aspects of exercise variation. So after basically, Doug goes through and justifies why he thinks it's accurate enough, which I don't think he does a really good job of there. He basically just gives his reasons for why he does it that way, that it's simple, but doesn't really justify how it's accurate enough, at least from my standpoint. My perception is that he didn't do a good job of convincing me that these are accurate enough. He didn't create that justification, right? He basically, showed, well, it's accurate at 0 and 100%, and therefore if it moves in that direction, it moves in that direction. And like I said, from a principle perspective, that might be a fine, way of looking at it. But then from a actual comparison across exercises, you simply have to be more accurate than that. So after that, basically the entire video, I think it's like close to 100 minutes or something, is just followed by numerous lies, false accusations, and things taken purposely out of context, or they're out of context to appear false. I'm assuming, based off of how easy it is to see the context if you watch the video, it's either these were this completely negligent in terms of now how they're taken out of context, or they had to have been purposely taken out of context. Neither one puts Doug in a position to then say that I was being deceptive, when actually those roles would be reversed there. Okay, as well as there's some more inaccurate models basically used to justify things and irrelevant arguments, which was kind of my key point in the first video. Is okay, are we using bad math and talking about things that aren't important to exaggerate the difference of these exercises, or make false justifications on exercise decisions that maybe, you would have chose the other direction or whatever, or maybe you just wouldn't have thought there was that much of a difference between these exercises if you had an accurate model and you weren't necessarily looking at a bunch of irrelevant points. So we agree the math is wrong. Accurate enough is subjective, and this is where the biggest disagreement on the physics was. I think, because Doug did admit that when I showed that, how the model is inaccurate, he said, yes, that was correct. But Doug accused me of going into the weeds, by being this accurate, that, I was just trying to be, deceptive and distract and being a politician because I was because I was pointing out how inaccurate it was. And in some cases, it was a magnitude of 50% or 100%, you know. And then when we added additional context of what would have been maybe a better exercise comparison or whatnot, you know, sometimes it was, you know, 150, 200, like 3 times the difference of what Doug's original model that was inaccurate was saying, right? And so I went into the multiple variables because I didn't want to point out like, hey, here's one thing that you got wrong, you know, therefore that your whole system is bad or whatever. It's like, no, I wanted to show that, you know, when we look at multiple inaccuracies that are all biased in the same way, what we end up with is something that is very biased after that, right? So I was trying to do that and be thorough out of respect, but Doug accuses me of, you know, being a bad person for being thorough in that case. So I apologize if it came off that way, Doug, but honestly, I was being thorough out of respect, and to make it not seem petty or whatever, I was being thorough so that I could be accurate, right? Same reason that I, you know, watched and read the stuff, okay? So if we just throw context and truth out the window, context and truth be damned. So instead of creating a counter argument, defending the position, it ends up being just a smear campaign that's based on lies and false context, some of which that, you know, we're going to run through right now. So my comments addressing the misinformation in this video on Doug's posts were deleted from his video, which is one of the reasons that I'm making it here. But that just goes to show that, like, I'm not, you know, one to criticize people blocking people or banning people. Or, I mean, as a content creator, you know, sometimes you just don't want to deal with people that are being argumentative or they're trolling, etc. So I'm not going to hold that part of this against, like, you know, Doug can block me or whatever, etc. Like, you know, I can block him, etc. And I don't think that's relevant at all. But I just want to know that I did take the effort to put that there, and it is deleted. So no big deal. We'll address it here. Okay. So the first and most obvious one, Doug accuses me of not defining a moment arm properly, okay? And I defined a moment arm like, and this was, you know, and I admitted this was a simplification of the definition, right? Because I used the word joint instead of axis, right? So that, you know, so that people don't have to, like, you know, people are coming in here and we can talk about the knee and the elbow and they don't have to think about axis or whatever. I mean, you'd be surprised at, you know, geez, these two words that we're going to talk about, perpendicular and parallel, how people confuse those things. So I tried to make this video as simple as possible because I was trying to speak to the people that basically have had a very, like, culty or emotional response to this material because they're just blindly believing what somebody says and not willing to think any deeper on it. So I didn't want to create any more obstacles for anybody that needed a very simple explanation. And I thought this was accurate, and we'll look at this here, right? So I said a moment arm is the distance between the joint and the resistance perpendicular to the direction of the resistance, right? And so that is very important. A moment arm will always be perpendicular to the resistance. If it was parallel to the resistance, it would essentially mean that there was no torque on the joint, right? There was zero resistance, right? So it's like, it'd be like, okay, if, you know, if you were doing a bicep curl with the cable parallel to your forearm, you know, that's essentially what we'd be about. Like, if it's perfectly parallel, it would never cross the joint, right? So to have a resistance, like, the only way it could be parallel is if the, you know, resistance was pulling straight to the joint, etc. I'm, you know, talking around myself here. The point is, Doug says it should be parallel. And let's just look at this. This is some stuff, like, I just pulled this from Oxford. You can Google this in, you know, 10 seconds. Just Google moment arm definition, and every single one of those is going to say perpendicular distance. They're all going to say perpendicular distance. So when we draw a moment arm, that line is perpendicular to the line of resistance. Okay? So you have an axis, right? A pivot point. It's the joint in most cases, right? It's not always exactly on the joint, you know, depending on the shape of the bones and stuff like that. But for the illustrative purposes here, it's basically a joint, right? And when we're talking about human movement, or at least very close to that joint, there is an axis of rotation, okay? And then we have some sort of resistance, whether that be gravity because we're using a free weight, whether that be a cable, whether it be a machine, whether it be we're overcoming momentum, inertia, etc. The moment arm is perpendicular to where that resistance action is, always perpendicular. So within the first minute or whatever, Doug's like, oh, Kassem is wrong, and it could not be more opposite. I mean, this is the definition of a moment arm. That's it, right? It's the distance between those two things, you know, and we draw that as a line, right? And we draw that to the line of force, which is another line that we use to represent the direction and the position of that action of force. So anyway, that's a moment arm. I was right there. I was correct. I don't know why Doug felt the need to try and point something so obvious out. Again, this is why this is just such a shameful video to have to be making here. Then continues on, more false assumptions, right? I covered this a little bit, but basically Doug, like, I don't know, either negligently or purposely misinterprets the way I say loadability, resistance challenge, muscular bias, right? After criticizing people for not reading his book. I covered this in the chart. You know where that's coming from, but basically, you know, if I were to just basically, you know, put a new definition on somebody else's terms, then yeah, I could obviously go in and, you know, criticize their argument if I'm basically swapping out whatever they say for, you know, or whatever their terms are and just putting my own definitions on them. This is why I created my video and I limited my explanations to the context of Doug's models. And I didn't leave the model like to complicate things or to go elsewhere. I tried to stay within the context of Doug and his terminology as much as possible. Okay. So then we keep going through this. Doug applies that my statement that a leg extension pad applies force roughly 75% the length of the, I put in here femur, didn't I? All right, so here, this is where I get in trouble, right? So this should be tibia, right? So I, if you guys can't tell, don't do spell check stuff very often, right? Or especially with something like this, man. I put this together super fast. Like I've spent like, you know, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes on this presentation thing. And so this is what you guys gonna get, right? You get my grammar mistakes, you get my spelling mistakes, etc. So anyway, 75% length of the tibia, right? And he makes it seem like I'm saying that like this is an exact statement and it's always this distance or whatever. And in reality, I was just simply saying that when we're comparing a squat to the leg extension, right? If we're looking at the leg extension, the lever is always going to be a little bit smaller because it's never going to be 100%. And I said on average, it's going to be roughly about 75%. That's about how far down that line of force is going to be going through the tibia the way most people set up on a leg extension. And I also covered the fact that that wouldn't always be the case, right? And when I measured the guy in the actual example Doug used, it was a little bit more, right? It was, I don't know, it was closer to 80% or something like that. But the fact is that when we're doing that, like if you use 100% of the tibia, you are biasing that argument towards the leg extension being, you know, much more efficient than the squat than what it really is. And then when you combine that with bad math on top of the squat, you know, then, I mean, you come up with a very biased argument in that case, right? So in fact, the placement of the shin pad is going to vary. It's going to be based off the diameter of the pad, the adjustability of the machine, the length of someone's tibia, and their personal preference for comfort. So, I mean, here you go. I took like 30 seconds on Google, pulled up an image of somebody doing the leg extension, right? And look, lo and behold, right? I measured their tibia. There's a ruler right on here. It's exactly 75%, right? Now, that doesn't mean that this guy couldn't, you know, maybe get that pad a little lower, that maybe they get that pad a little higher. But this was a great example because this is, guess what? It's one of those machines where you don't have the adjustment on it. It just kind of self-levels right into that groove on your tibia. So basically in this machine, that pad kind of chooses its own spot. And where is it? It's right at 75%. So if you have one that doesn't do that, could you adjust it a little bit lower? Yes. Could you adjust it a little bit higher? Maybe. If you were really tall or really short, or I should say you had really long or really short femurs, you know, could this, you potentially be exceeding, you know, one end of this pad's direction, et cetera, and so it would be a little higher or lower respectively on you? Yes, but unless it's like going through your foot, it was never going to be 100%. It was always going to be less. So at 100%, we're always over exaggerating. So when I was talking about this concept, I said, hey, you know, roughly it's going to be, you know, at 75%. But I mean, you just go through Google Image, you'll find some people that are like closer to 60, 90%. You literally have some people that have the pad on their feet, which that's just not ideal at all. So the fact that, you know, I covered this in a contextual nuanced way when I was describing this in my video, and then Doug took that 75%, you know, screenshot and then said, you know, like, oh, look, here's the model I'm using, and it's not exactly 75%. Kassem is being intentionally deceptive and lying. That's actually being deceptive and lying because that's not what I said, right? And I tried to provide more context and be more accurate, and to then remove that context to make it seem like I was actually being deceptive is double deceptive. if that's a thing. So let's move on really quick here. Another example of some of the behavior that was going on here is basically Doug used a slide and said, hey, Kassem doesn't even cover the most, important, arrow of net forces, in this exercise, etc. And what he did is he used the slide before I covered that point, right? So he just took a screenshot of one slide earlier, and then in the next slide, I literally covered this point. So on the left, here's the screenshot of the arrow that Doug was referring to, which is this blue arrow, right? And in my case over here, I have the green arrow, which both of those essentially are representing the net between the body weight forces, the cable forces, and the ground forces all coming together, right? Now, obviously, they're slightly different. Doug's in a different position in one video than I, and to be honest, you can't be accurate with this without actually knowing exactly, what Doug's body weight is, how it's proportioned, and what that cable is. So in both cases here, I'm assuming, maybe Doug went, full math and, calculated that blue line, but I'm guessing he didn't because it's a super pain in the ass. So both of our lines are a subjective reference, example of about where that would be. But the point is I covered that concept and I did make the line, right? So for him to say that I don't do that and just simply take a screenshot of my earlier slide, but while doing this, say that I'm being dishonest and deceptive, again, the irony is not lost, okay? The next one that was pretty egregious here is Doug spends this absurd amount of time saying that, I tried to lie about the dip by inflating the angle of the forearm, right? And he does this by using an image that essentially is not the image I was referencing, right? So in my original video, I took two dip images, a bottom position and a mid-range position, and I demonstrated the elbow path going forward as well as the bottom position. And so what Doug did, and the irony of this continues, because you would not compare the elbow position of somebody in the bottom of a dip to somebody halfway up a dip anyway. So the fact that he thinks that this would have been a valid comparison anyway, that would have been the thing. That would have been the thing I argued, right? I wouldn't have been like, oh, he doesn't know how to draw a line to the elbow. I'm like, he's using an irrelevant comparison right here, right? That's where it would have really been deceiving. And the other inference that you could take of is that because this position is upright, well, the bottom position actually would be further back. So even though I will admit that the opacity in the video that I did, and I don't know how it's going to show up in this one, so I have not, on the left here, I have not changed the opacity from the original slide. But this video, or this image, I'm sorry, is two images that overlaying, so they're blurred together, if you will. And so what I've actually done here, if you can tell, I don't know how good this looks online, but this dip is two pictures. It's not just a bigger arm. It's two pictures. So I have drawn the blue line through the humerus in the two positions that this is in. If you can kind of see, right here's the back of the tricep in the lower position. Here's the back of the tricep in the upper position, if you can see my mouse. But essentially what I wanted to illustrate here is that the elbow does not go forward much as this person is going up through the dip. And so I have this black arrow pointing to the back of where the arrow or where the elbow is in the bottom position, right? But what Doug did is he drew on top of the top position one and then accused me of saying that the forearm is at 18 degrees, but it really wasn't, and that I was trying to be deceptive by putting the line on the point of the elbow, and that I don't know where the elbow joint is or how it works, or I'm just a bad, evil person trying to lie and discredit him, and I'm out to get him. When in reality, it's like, even if you thought that was true, Doug, right? Even if you had me dead to rights that I was just out to get you, why on earth would you be drawing and comparing a mid-range position dip to a bottom position dip? Why would you even consider that, right? So let's actually look even closer at this, right? So I've changed the opacity in this so that hopefully it's showing up better. So on the left here, I think it'll be your left too, whatever. But you see the one that just has one line. That is the original two images on top of each other with the opacity kind of sucky for the bottom position, right? And then as we go towards the top or towards the other one, then you can see the other arm come in, right? And it just so happens to, like, the way these two images overlapped, it just so happens that because you're combining two skin tone things over another, is that it just kind of looks like in the upright position that, you know, that could be a shorter arm or whatever. But this is the reality. This is over here, you see that the elbow is further back. So the forearm at the bottom was 18 degrees, right? And in case the opacity on this is still messing with you guys, this is the actual image, right? So like this is the actual image. You can see the line going through the joint, right? On the left, you can see how Doug drew his line going through the joint, right? So you can see how deceptive I was trying to be here when I did this drawing, right? To compare, you know, this dip to the other, right? Because in reality, you have two different individuals here, two different structures, and in Doug's dip, he's leaning way forward, right? Which would bring that forearm up and make it, you know, less elbow extension dominant. And we just have kind of what we'd call like an omni, you know, just like kind of going up and down dip on the right. And I was trying to illustrate two things with this. One is that not everybody's, you know, and not everybody's body structure or their technique is going to limit them to that little of a forearm angle, right? In this instance, like this isn't something I staged. This, you can look at this gym. This is a gym that I haven't been into for like several years or whatever. It's Cyan out in San Francisco. And this is Austin, who doesn't even work with us anymore. So this clearly is not a staged image. That is actually at an 18-degree forearm angle at the bottom of the position. The ridiculousness to stage that I was doing this deceptively by using a different image from a higher position is both impractical, right? And that is actually what would be being deceptive. So this is the image that Doug compared, right? This is him up in the mid-range, right? We would not compare these two exercises, right? We would not compare the elbow position halfway up in here other than comparing it for the same person to discuss how much that elbow travels forward, which lo and behold was one of the things that I was discussing when I was referencing why some people might experience more of a challenge in their triceps, either because their starting angle is or because of the way they can articulate their body to maintain a little bit more leverage on the elbow extensors during that lift. I did this in the context of defending Mike Israetel's point of how, you know, dips can be challenging for the triceps. Is that me saying that I think dips are the must-do? Are they my top 20 exercise? Blah, 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 whatever. No. I'm simply was pointing out that the bias here is making it seem like these exercises are a lot further apart than they really are. Within that same area of my presentation, I covered how Doug was basically saying that a 10-degree forearm angle, or 80 degrees, depending on which perspective you look, it's the same thing, like really vertical, right? He was saying that a 10-degree, you know, angle would equal an 11% change in magnification or more arm length. And moment arm length. Did I say more on length there? I mean, subliminal messaging maybe on my part. Like I didn't say that on purpose. Moment arm length, which was actually off by about 100%, meaning that the reality of how long the moment arm is at 10 degrees is almost twice 11%, right? It's almost 22%. So if you look at this image here, the red, which I had represented as 11%, and then 10 degrees in the orange is the actual moment arm, right? So I started off by demonstrating that Doug's model is actually off by a factor of 100%. And that's a big difference. I mean, because if we were talking about that with the dumbbell, that's basically the difference of twice the weight in the dumbbell comparison that we would be using, et cetera, whatever, right? So it's a big jump in load magnification, right, between reality and Doug's model. Then, because one, Doug was using a very chest dominant version, right? And the fact that people are going to vary from different people are going to vary. I took another example where the forearm was at 18 degrees, which now you guys know was a legit 18 degrees. And I showed how in that instance, that person would have about 3 times the load magnification or 3 times the moment arm as what Doug was claiming in his model. Right? So I was just showing how biased or how exaggerated that model could be because there's an exercise technique being used on one side that basically we could say, like everybody knows, like chest forward style dips are going to be, you know, less elbow loading and more pec. And then if you sit up a little bit more vertically, your elbows have to go back a little bit further, right? So differences in technique, differences in body type and structure, right, could mean that, like, okay, there's a huge difference between what a person actually experiences in the dip and what Doug's model is suggesting. So when he's saying, this is this much worse than a dumbbell tricep extension, I'm simply showing the difference was not as big. And I also covered some other anecdotes about the mid-range position of why there might be some pros to doing a dip type motion over the dumbbell only, right? And these are the important nuances when it comes to making the best decisions in terms of your exercise selection when you account for all of the things. So again, Doug's claiming that I said 18 degrees is 3 times the moment arm of 10 degrees, right? And that's not at all what I said. So basically he took an image where I had his 11% and the 18 degrees, right? And then just remove the context of what I was talking about and be like, oh, look, he's saying 18 degrees is 3 times, 10 degrees. And that wasn't what I was saying. I was saying 18 degrees is 3 times what you claimed 10 degrees was, right? It wouldn't have been 3 times if you would have actually accurately measured what the moment arm at 10 degrees was. But because you were off by a factor of 100%, then yeah, the 18 degrees was 3 times the difference than what you said 10 degrees was. But it's really not even double what 10 degrees actually is, right? It's about 40% more, something like that, okay? Or it's 140%, whatever perspective that you happen to be looking at. So again, while doing this, Doug is claiming that I'm being dishonest and deceptive and that I'm doing so for profit. Okay, keep that in mind. Okay. The next thing, and to be honest, like if something really gets me in these videos in terms of like, people looking at this and be like, oh, Kassem's an idiot or whatever, right? And they haven't actually watched my video. It's going to be these little demonstrations that he does with the scales and these nuts, and he's showing how the angles change as you, or how it changes as you put one nut in one side, multiple in the other, etc., like baskets. So again, accuracy is important. So how accurate of a representation is this of the ratios? Well, what you would have to do first off is, in the example of, say, the leg extension for the squat, you have to account for, not using the full tibia. So one, the lever would have to be shortened on one. You could make the argument, depending on where the axis is, like in the squat, whether, like how the person's bone structure and lengths and foot or whatever, like maybe the squat could be a little bit longer than the tibia. But those nuances aside, if we were looking at this, first off, you would have to account for the lever lengths, which would be a big difference, right? Having a longer lever on one side than the other. And the other thing is, if you're looking at a ratio, you can't just put, a couple carabiners on one side, a couple baskets on one side, and then just do the nuts. You actually have to account for the total mass. Now, the lighter the baskets are, the lighter the carabiners are, the greater the influence the nuts have on balancing that. But what you'll notice is that Doug's putting in what, my calculations were, that it gets pretty close to accurate, but it's a little bit off. And then when you factor in that, okay, maybe the lever lengths weren't, done appropriately, maybe, we're not actually accounting. So like a legit 3-to-1 ratio would mean that in that right basket in this photo, you would also have to have 2 extra carabiners and also be hanging 2 extra baskets. So there was legit a 3-to-1 ratio, but it's not a 3-to-1 ratio. So depending on how much heavier those nuts are than, the basket and the carabiner, that can throw that percentage off enough that explains exactly why it doesn't balance exactly as it should for the model he's trying to represent in comparing my version versus his version. So, would something like that be, is that cool for showing the principle? Absolutely, right? Is it accurate in the sense of this type of a debate? Not unless you'd actually do it accurately, especially because we have no idea how heavy any of those elements are, right? Now, I'm assuming that the carabiners are light and the baskets are fairly light, right? But I'm assuming that, two extra carabiners and 2 baskets is, maybe that's the equivalent of 10 or 20% of one of those nuts, right? And so that's a big difference when we're looking at a ratio. So again, accuracy matters, especially if you're going to go out and accuse somebody, of being deceitful. So the last thing here, which was, I think, like a total fake news move. I think this is the last thing. I lose track. Context here, right? So I was on Abel's podcast, and we were talking about, what we're doing in terms of research, in terms of trying to separate out the ability to bias different tissues and stuff like that, right? And yes, we are pioneering that. Like, as far as I know, we're the only people that are trying to use these proxies in this way, combining the multiple proxies and doing the modeling for these individual divisions like this and putting it all together. And so, yeah, in that video, I used the word pioneering to describe what we're doing with our lab work, right? Now, he basically, because I had a problem with him saying that he's like, I said that, he comes off as that he acts like he's pioneering, the first person to, bring physics and, to meatheads. And I consistently credit Tom Purvis for being the person that has, been teaching and, covering physics for the fitness industry, physics of resistance training. Tom Purvis, I think, that's him. Right. And then there's been a ton of other people, both students of his and whatever I learned from Tom. So that have been doing this for quite a long time. So I said that comment of like, look, I don't think it's fair for Doug to act like, he's the first person and that he's basically, putting his stamp on it, like, yes, this is my thing. I discovered this, or whatever. I even admitted at a basic level that we only cover physics, at a basic level in our courses. We basically cover, hey, here's the minimum that you need to then be able to understand and apply the rest of the information. If you want to learn that stuff deeper, then you go to Tom Purvis and learn that stuff, because he teaches it in way more depth than I care to teach it by any means. Definitely, I would say to go to Tom Purvis over Doug. I mean, Tom Purvis teaches accurate, like his stuff is accurate. I don't agree with Tom on every application aspect of things, but I mean, in terms of the physics stuff, like, he's got it down better than anybody in our industry, right? And then he also proceeds to portray anyone who agrees with me in a very negative light, as if it's some sort of conspiracy, right? And so what he did is he took a clip of me saying pioneering and just repeated it over and over and over again after the statement that I said that, I don't like that he acts like he's the pioneer of physics in the fitness industry. And so then basically he just plays this words game, like total CNN, like fake news move of like, hey, I'm just going to take this clip out of context and I'm just going to put it here. And yes, because I used that word in the English language in another place, in another context, does that mean I can no longer use it anywhere else? Or does context and truth matter, right? And then, of course, he finishes this big, long video with the way he typically does, which is the reason that I've kind of, made the statement that I did about, the way he portrays some of this stuff, is he finishes with all these self-proclamations and self-high-fives and, just this pandering at the end, which he did at the end of the Israel video. And I just thought that was poor form. And I think, that's my honest opinion. I thought that was poor form. I thought it was completely irrelevant to the argument. I think it's completely irrelevant to the lack of argument here. Still, right? This is like, yeah, okay, cool. Like this is the math. It doesn't matter like how many Mr. Universes you won, how many bodybuilding things or whatever. It doesn't matter that if you don't think that I have the best physique at this point in my life or whatever, right? I mean, should I start pulling out like, hey, I've bench pressed this much, which, I managed to say that there's things that I've done, like there's lifts that I've done that are greater than the lifts that than Doug has done. Does that win me points in the argument? Or should we let the actual merits of the argument be what matters here, right? I mean, it's just ridiculous at this point, the way that people will bring in all the most irrelevant things into an argument rather than actually debate the topic at hand. So I don't know why there were just so many pure defamatory remarks in here, right? I thought that I did a good job of being thorough. I thought I covered the math, I covered it accurately. So for him to make assumptions of my motives, he claims that we're rivals, which we aren't. Like, we're not even in the same stratosphere in terms of our business, our influence. We don't even necessarily cover the same material. We cover things like just way, way different, right? Not the same volume material, not the same aspect of material, right? The fact that he works with this physics and he has these principle things or whatever, we cover that in like a couple hours, like that it makes up, 2% or something of one of our courses, et cetera. So, to act like this is some like me versus him thing, right? Or that I see him as this big, threat in the industry. I mean, it's completely ridiculous at this point, right? I mean, I'm trying to be as objective as possible so that I'm not punching down, and like I said, I thought I gave a very objective and fair assessment of everything. I thought I gave honest, objective opinions on the exercises. My mathematical and biomechanical arguments, they were correct. And none of the things that Doug disputed actually suggested that any of my stuff was wrong. The only areas where he'd be like, I was wrong, were areas where he was completely taking the information out of context or just falsifying what I said in general. So yeah, he made it seem like I was wrong by actually misrepresenting what I said. But all of the things that I did actually say were correct, and I didn't make it personal, right? And I also shared my opinion, like, of how Doug closed the Israel video and several others or whatnot, because I just think that, yeah, that was poor form. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, right? So recapping the whole video here, what we agreed on, the math in Doug's model is inaccurate. We both agreed that, I mean, he thinks it's accurate enough, but it is not actually accurate. It is not true, okay? Other than 0 and 100%, the model he is using is not the truth in terms of how those exercises, how that loading magnification would actually be measured. The pendulum hack squat leg extension, we both ranked those better than cable sissy squats and cable squats, right? We can both agree that Doug had a successful bodybuilding career and had a great physique, right? I'm not challenging his success in that area at all, right? What we disagreed on, I mean, very basically, what a moment arm is. Whether or not the inaccuracy in his model is relevant, right? Which I say it is, especially when you have so many of them stacked up, biasing in the same direction, right? How, if and important, the efficiency of loading is in exercise selection. In some cases, it may be more relevant than others, but in other instances, like comparing the leg extension to the squat, it's completely irrelevant, right? We disagree on his obsession with this perpendicularness because, you know, being more perpendicular does not always mean more better. The loading needs to be direct enough, but in some cases, being too direct limits the range of motion. It, you know, makes the profile actually worse because it makes it too biased to one position or the other, etc. So, you know, thinking that more perpendicular always means better is, like, you know, there's a point of diminishing returns. Like in terms of resistance profile, in terms of, you know, how efficient a resistance is, it needs to be good enough, right? But it doesn't need to be at the extreme. And there are plenty of examples where going to those extremes actually makes an exercise worse in some way, shape, or form. We disagreed on how to bias a muscle and actually what bias of muscle is, or what biasing a muscle is or consists of. He just interpreted as perpendicularness again, like some sort of obsession with perpendicularness. But I look at bias as like, you know, the difference in muscle participation, and that's going to include, you know, the amount of tension. It's going to include the amount of range of motion, what portions of the range those goes in, you know, and other factors in there, right? So it's like it's looking at the total bias of stimulus, if you will, because that's why we're doing the exercise, right? Is to get the stimulus. So we want to factor in the things that are going to matter for that stimulus and figure out which tissues are going to, you know, adequate or the most stimulus and which tissues are not, right? We disagreed on the value of the sissy and cable squat compared to other exercises, right? And it's, you know, it's perfectly fine for him to disagree on that if he wants to use his metrics or whatever, right? I presented my argument for why I didn't think they were as good. He presents his on why he thinks they are good, right? I disagree with some of the models and some of the arguments, and that's where disagreement and debate, like, that's where it should have been, right? That's what this whole discussion should have been around, the merits of, you know, these exercises and where they fit and how we're ranking these different elements of exercise selection. Okay. Another thing we debate or disagree on, obviously, is how to debate versus just to defame people that disagree with you. And if you're not familiar, defaming means like you are basically, you know, saying things that aren't true about them, right? It's essentially slander, which is essentially what his whole video is he's basically accusing me of ulterior motives, which he has no reason to believe, right? I've never, like, the fact that I critiqued his model and his exercises and shared my opinion on how he conducts himself here does not mean that I did that, you know, because I somehow think that's going to make me more money or because I have something personal against Doug. The math was incorrect because the math was incorrect, not because I wanted it to be correct, not because I don't like Doug, therefore the math was incorrect. The math was just incorrect. My difference of opinion on exercise is my difference of opinion on exercise. It existed before I knew who Doug was, right? And it will exist beyond this, right? Has nothing to do with that, right? So We very much so disagree on how to debate and how we should be discussing these things. As far as I'm concerned, in terms of Doug's response, Doug didn't argue any of my points other than saying he's okay with the inaccuracy of the models he uses, claiming they're accurate enough. Basically, that's the only counterpoint that Doug presented that was actually relevant. Every other point was either irrelevant or just a fabrication or technically wrong, right? So, he did some of the scale things that were technically wrong, and then he just made stuff up. He falsely represented images. He falsely represented phrases that I said. He falsely represented numbers and whatever through the screenshots. And yeah, so I mean, I don't consider those valid arguments because he's arguing against things that I didn't say. So it's very disappointing that Doug chose to spend, over an hour, which I mean, I probably spent over an hour in this. I don't know how long it's been. Over an hour making defamatory statements rather than debating my actual arguments, right? Because I love debating this stuff. I love nerding out on this stuff. And the fact that he did this type of video and while misrepresenting so many things that I said, and just being outright wrong on the moment arm thing, which, takes a 10-second Google search, etc., right? The irony is not lost on me or anyone else, the way he presented that video. And the tactics that he used versus and again, I have been open to a debate. I have encouraged this debate for months now, right? I originally made the offer for Doug to either continue that debate or actually come and visit our lab, right? Back in February of this year, right? And I have that email correspondence. I also emailed Doug basically everything that is in this video, pointing out all of the things that he said that were inaccurate, and I gave him the opportunity because I didn't want to have to make a video of me throwing mud back at Doug. I would say I offered hey, we can resolve this together mutually, clear up where maybe there was possible confusion on his part or whatnot, where he's misinterpreting what I'm saying or whatever, so that I wouldn't have to come out here and make it seem like Doug was being deceitful, because I don't really care if Doug is being, if Doug wants to be deceitful, that's Doug thing, right? I mean, do I care that people are lying about things that I said? Absolutely. I mean, honestly, for what's in this video and the way that video was, I'm pretty sure it could sue the pants off of Doug for a lot of the things that he said. But I mean, yeah, if I was in this for profit, yeah, cool, that would be the move I go. But I mean, honestly, this just kind of, it just lets the pieces fall where they may at this point in time, right? So, I mean, I covered the math accurately. I did it objectively. Doug responded by agreeing with my, initial concern with the accuracy of the models, and then just jumping down rabbit's holes to say a bunch of defamatory things. And I think that says way more about Doug than it does any of the points that I made or any contribution to the argument. So if you watch this whole video, thank you. I appreciate you listening to my defense here, but I'm sorry that this video even had to exist. Doug, I'm sorry that you took my critique so personally, and I'm sorry that you didn't feel that you could, articulate that to me, and I'm sorry that you don't feel that you can have a debate with other people in the industry without behaving in such a way, and that goes beyond this video, but a bunch of your other prior videos as well. So am I the idiot for not expecting a response like this? Maybe so, but I thought that unlike other people, if I actually provided, some objective, calculations and ways of looking at things, that maybe this could have been a bit more of an academic discussion, that would have been possible. I was wrong on that, and that alone.